Testing. Hello, my name is Helen, and I'd like to offer everyone a warm welcome to the Cryosphere Pavilion, to everyone here, and also those watching online, including at the Cryosphere Pavilion hubs in Stockholm and Geneva. Our first speaker in this session on Life Without Glaciers is Regine Hock, so I'll hand over to you.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Thank you very much. The title of my talk is essentially my conclusion that every degree of warming matters for the melting of the glaciers in the future. I will talk about glaciers outside the ice sheets, not the ice sheet in Greenland and Antarctica, but all glaciers outside the ice sheets. That's about 200,000 glaciers that cover an area of Texas or an area of Spain and the United Kingdom together. And if you melted all the glaciers, sea level would rise about 40 centimeters. These glaciers have lost mass, have thinned and retreated during the last 100 years and also the last, especially the last decades. Here's an example from Alaska, massive retreat, Patagonia, dramatic retreat. And here an example from Iceland showing that it just takes a few years for a tremendous retreat here. This is just 13 years and the glacier is not longer visible for this spot from this spot here. Another example here in Switzerland, tremendous retreat just during the last like 1.5 decades. When we look at all glaciers in the world, what you see here is the thinning rate averaged over all glaciers in the world. And what you can see is there's more and more mass loss per year. So now the last decade, there's a thinning rate of about 50 to 60 centimeters per year, averaged over all glaciers in the world. But there's large regional differences. Some regions are thinning less, maybe only like 10, 20 centimeters, especially in the polar regions. But like in the European Alps, in the Caucasus, and the tropics, there's thinning rates of 1 meter per year, average over all these glaciers in these regions. So how will glaciers change in the future? Here's an example of a projection of the largest glacier in the European Alps, the Alps Glacier in Switzerland, for a high emission scenario and a low emission scenario. And you see dramatic differences between the scenarios. So almost a complete disappearance for the high emission scenario and quite some ice is left for the low emission scenario. So emphasizing that it really makes a difference on which emission pathway we are on. Here is what you see here is projections of all glaciers in the world, differentiated for different glacier regions. Starting in 2015 with 100% of glacier mass, and then you see how much percentage is left over by the end of the century. On a global scale, the glaciers are projected to lose about 20 to 40% of their current mass, depending on the emission scenario. And that corresponds to a sea level equivalent of like 8 to 17 centimeters. But you see big differences between the regions. Regions where there's little ice maybe lose like 10 to 20% of their mass, whereas regions with very little ice on smaller glaciers, like here, Scandinavia, Central Europe, or low latitudes, for the high emission scenario, there's what is projected is almost complete deglaciation. So all glaciers lost. What you see here is how much mass will remain in 2100 for different temperature scenarios. Here for 1.5, the bluer it is, the more mass is remaining. Dark blue, almost 100% remaining. by the end of the century. And the redder it is, the more mass is lost. The dark red is only like 10% of the ice mass is remaining in each of these pixels where there are glaciers in the world. And wherever you see a black dot, that means all the glaciers in that pixel are lost by the end of the century. And now when we go through, you have plus 2 degrees, plus 3 degrees, plus 4 degrees, plus 5 degrees, you see a lot more black dots where the glaciers are completely gone, and a lot more red where very, very little ice is left over. So only where there's blue in the high polar regions, even with a 5-degree increase, there's ice left. And here you see the global glacier change by 2100 per degree global warming above pre-industrial. And what is really sort of fascinating to see is that with every degree temperature increase, the mass loss, the sea level rise, the area loss, the number of glaciers lost just linearly increases. And the thinning rate is here for the 6-degree temperature increase. It's like 6 meters thinning per year over all glaciers in the world. So what's really interesting is this linear increase for every single degree temperature. So every degree makes a difference. So limiting the global warming reduces the glacier contribution to sea level rise and the glacier losses. No matter what variable you look at, it's highly sensitive to every single degree warming. So I just want to wrap up here with some conclusions. I did not talk about the impacts of these glacier changes, so my colleagues will do that in the next talks. But the main message is really glacier decline can be slowed by limited warming. Avoiding each degree temperature increase makes a difference for the future of the glaciers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Regina. And we'll now move to Bethan Davies, who is joining us remotely from Royal Holloway. Bethan, the floor is yours.
Hello, hopefully this is working. You can hear me all right. I'm going to talk about life without glaciers, go through some examples of where we might be. This is how much ice there is in the world. The size of the circle, it tells you the volume of ice. So you can see most of the ice that's not in the ice sheets is in the glaciers around the ice sheets. So around Antarctica, around the Greenland ice sheet. That's in the Arctic up here, but also substantial volumes of ice in Alaska, Patagonia, and in the Arctic. There are smaller amounts of ice in Europe and in the Himalaya, where these are all summed. Altogether, there's 153 billion tons of ice in the world, and this is enough to raise global sea level by about 32 centimeters. This is a huge volume of ice. And all across the world, these glaciers are shrinking. They are losing more mass than is being replenished each year. So each year they shrink a little bit more. This is a very coherent signal. We're seeing this in almost all regions. This means that glaciers are contributing substantially to sea level rise. This is all the ice. This is the loss of all the ice in the world. So the lighter blue colors, this is floating ice. So floating ice, when we lose it, it doesn't directly contribute to sea level rise, but it does have a very important dynamic impact on our polar environments. The grounded ice is ice above sea level. Sometimes this is called land ice because it's grounded on land rather than floating. And you can see that we have Antarctica and Greenland, and then the biggest, darkest purple slice is the volume lost from glaciers. In total, between 1994 and 2017, Earth lost 28 trillion tons of ice. And you can see by the thickening of these wedges that the volume of ice loss is increasing. The rate has increased by about 57% since the 1990s. And altogether, glaciers are accounting for about a quarter of global sea level rise. So you can see this global sea level budget here, glaciers accounting for 24% of that observed 3 millimeters of sea level rise every year. This graph carries on from what Regine was saying and talks about global ice volume loss. And Earth is losing around 267 billion tons of ice each year. 1 gigaton of ice would be a cube of water about a kilometre high and a kilometre wide and a kilometre deep. So this is almost an unimaginable amount of ice that's being lost to the oceans each year. And this is accelerating. These colours show the mean elevation change rate, and you can see the very dark reds in places like Alaska and Central Europe and the Southern Andes, where glaciers are thinning very, very substantially. And all of this is contributing to global sea level rise. So are we heading towards a world without glaciers? And it depends very much on what pathway we follow. We can see that the pathway we're on at the moment is not really along the pathways that would be in line with retaining most of the global ice volume. These histograms show how much sea level will rise just from glaciers, so not including the ice from the ice sheets, how much sea level will rise from glaciers under different scenarios. So under the SSP 119 scenario, we would have about 7 centimeters sea level rise from global glaciers by the year 2100. So we would have retained most of our global ice. But under SSP 245, we'd have 11 centimeters sea level rise from glaciers, which is a substantial loss of global ice volume. And this would mean that people in low-lying coastal areas are very susceptible to flooding. And in fact, if we put the global loss of glacier ice in with the other loss of land ice from Antarctica and from Greenland and from the thermal expansion of the ocean, we could well see 0.5 meter global sea level rise, along with substantial loss of global glaciers by the year 2100. But it's not just sea level rise that's an important impact of global glacier loss. Global glaciers can be thought of as water towers. They accumulate snow in the accumulation season, and they melt, and their meltwater buffers downstream flow, and that can protect people against droughts. As glaciers shrink, they're less able to provide that buffering ability and make things more susceptible to drought. And if we look at the Himalaya, we can see there are substantial demands on the water from the glaciers in the Himalaya for things like hydropower or irrigation or industry. These glaciers in the Himalaya are under increasing demand as well. These spider plots show how these glaciers in the Himalaya are threatened. If we look at the Indus, we can see the increase in population and increasing GDP are threatening to increase the amount of water that is needed. There is also decreasing supply. So showing part of the same plot that Regine showed, we have increasing temperatures and shrinking glaciers in this area. And this is forecast to continue, which decreases the amount of meltwater that is available for people downstream. If we have increasing demand but shrinking glaciers, we're likely to see increased water tension. So are we likely to have a life without glaciers? If we think about SSP 245, this suggests around 11 centimeters of sea level rise from glaciers by the year 2100. And the risks of coastal flooding are greatly increased. Only about 40% of glacier area would remain in Central Asia, and this would suggest that we would have severe water shortages in many countries that rely on mountain glaciers for a dependable water supply. We need strong commitments to reduce global greenhouse gases emissions in line with SSP 119 to retain these glaciers that are so important for our way of life. Thank you.
Oh, 1 second. All right. I will continue where Bethan also, she mentioned the Himalayas and these water towers. I'll talk a bit about those and the impacts of glacier loss there. First, why are they important, these mountains? Well, they catch more snowfall and rainfall compared to the lowlands. And as mentioned, they store water in buffers as snow and ice. And they are a continuous water supply also during dry periods. So they capture precipitation, there's snow, glaciers, there's water stored up there in lakes and reservoirs. And this water is very important downstream, used in irrigation, for domestic use, in industry, and also used by nature. This map shows taking into account these factors, so the amount of supply upstream and the amount of water that's required from the mountains downstream, and it shows in this area here, high mountain Asia, the Asian river basins, it shows high values there. It shows that the water towers, the water from the mountains is very important there. Here you see a map of this region. So there's about 10 large river basins originating in these mountains. And as an example, irrigation in South Asia is a very large water using sector. The Indus Basin has the largest irrigation scheme in the world. And on average, about 60% of the water used there originates from glacier and snowmelt. And this can vary also, it varies throughout the year. In some parts of the year, about 90% of the water is coming from glacier and snowmelt. And these are exactly the dry periods of the year where also the crops are sown. So in these months, glacier and snow meltwater is critical. Now, what are the impacts of changes in glaciers and patterns of snow, like we heard in previous talks? The impacts on that for the hydrology. Well, they change the sources and the totals of runoff, which I'll talk about a bit. They cause seasonal shifts and changes in extremes. So, for example, the glacier melt, it's expected that first this will increase by stronger melt rates, but when glaciers start to disappear, this will start decreasing again. And this point in time, it may have already passed or it's in the future decades, it depends on the location, but that peak water is a turning point there. On the other hand, there's also a shift from snow melt towards more rainfall runoff. And this transition is, there's a transition towards less snowmelt and more rainfall runoff with higher temperatures. And there's a total change in the water supply from upstream to downstream, but that depends really on the future precipitation projections, where most projections indicate increase in the region. So one could think there might be more water available in the future, but the composition changes. So there may be less glacier melt, less snow melt, more rainfall runoff, but that doesn't mean that you can also harness that water. This rainfall runoff comes very erratically and also much during monsoon season there, where you already have an excess of water. Seasonal shifts, on the other hand, there's an earlier onset of the melt season. So you see that in the example below for the Salween River, you see that snow melt is earlier in the season, which is not necessarily a problem, but there's also a stronger monsoon season because precipitation increases mostly during the rain season, the monsoon, where you already have an excess of water. And even this increase in precipitation and the shift from melt to rainfall runoff, that causes a more rapidly responding hydrological system, so much more erratic flows. The flows are then less continuous and steady, which is now provided by meltwater, and you get more extremes on two sides, more dry periods, where you don't have the glacier and snow melt water that provide you water during drought. There will also be more droughts in the future because precipitation patterns get more erratic, and more flooding extremes, which will cause then direct damage and casualties, but of course also increased erosion and sedimentation, which causes damage to, for example, hydropower structure and limits their lifetime. This shows that a change of the return level in a flood that returns every 50 years, an increase of 50 to 100% in the water level there is not an exception. So we'll see more of these pictures in the future, not only floods, but also other natural hazards, which will be talked about in a later talk, I think. Then on the other side is the demand. Bethan already mentioned. In this region, there's a steep population growth, showing here the case for the Indus, the population scenarios, and populations are expected to double or in worst case triple in the next 100 years. And these people will also increase their water use per person when their GDP goes up in these countries. And cropland area increases, where the meltwater is already now an essential source for irrigation there. And with the vanishing of this one continuous water supply from meltwater, then another readily available water supply is tapped, and that's groundwater in this region. It's already an overdraft of groundwater there, but when glacier melt starts to lower, you see that especially in the right, in the worst case scenario, then these red spots pop up, and these are spots where groundwater will be depleted in an unsustainable way. So should we go this way? I don't think so. And this study also shows that mountain water will become more important in the future. Not necessarily the meltwater or the snowmelt, but the total water supply from the mountains will become more important, and in particular because of the increasing demand for this water. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I was and when we bring that must not necessarily be a bad picture. A friend of mine always says, but thinking about glaciers poses a real problem, and that is because of the Himalayans are very young, geologically very young. They are not that consolidated, so they are more prone mountain chain. And I talk particularly about this part Colombia and Venezuela, and there are geologically young. They are in the tropics. Not just over a summer season, but 12 months a year. A high Greek seasonality. And we know that a lesser efficient mass removal through sublimation, but they cause a higher ablation, higher melting rates, with the same amount of energy El Nino phases, and particularly the El Nino phases, they are wet, El Nino events with warming, climate. This is projected to increase even more. So we have settings on a regional scale, quicker than anywhere else, based on the same temperature rise, not as high as the Himalayas. So apart from those very high but they are very small in area, so there is if you just wait to be adapted to the present climate. The Himalayan glaciers in the Andes are for about 6 months in some regions the only water source. There is no water reservoirs because they are too steep, too young. So there is a real water. Some others with bigger glaciers, they have so that is the water issue. Then we have today. This is particularly a problem. So the glaciers push towards the slopes, and once the glaciers are gone, we observe proglacial lake issue, which is a tremendous problem. Delayed response to the post little ice age. Glacier outburst floods in Peru. They know. Almost every ministerial position you can imagine, from agriculture to they do a lot, and Christian and also myself, we were helping people. And then comes another issue, and that is the contamination, which is stored in the ice. Partially, that comes from the human impact from mining, but there is also a kind of contamination I'm not an expert in, but it's underlaying a natural contamination. So some rivers coming from glaciers are not even used by the farmers because they are contaminated. And that is already known since long. And the more this area gets ice-free, the more of this contaminated water or the contamination goes into the runoff. And this is another big problem. So the decision makers on all scales, from local to governmental scale in Peru and also in Bolivia, they know about these problems. We have been telling them since about 3-4 decades. And it is a complicated situation. It's not so easy. But I consider that as a real problem, although I think in some other regions of the world, nice lakes will develop, the forests will grow up, it will green, and maybe it's a different kind of tourism which will develop, but in the tropical Andes, they really face problems. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Christian Huggel from Zürich University.
Good evening. I hope you can hear me. So thanks, Georg. I'm actually just continuing. And this is also from a picture from a cemetery in Varas region Georg was referring to. And you see exactly those peaks that Georg was mentioning, from 5,000 to 6,000. That will not necessarily imply that all people will die when the glaciers die. However, colleagues have found out with indigenous people living in the area that they basically saying, when glaciers disappear, we will also disappear, because of their very intimate relation with mountains and glaciers. Now, this is coming back to the Alps. This is a visualization of how this could look like as the biggest glacier of the Alps, the Great Alech Glacier, would disappear. You see a new landscape is actually forming. New lakes are also emerging, which have both a potential and risk as well. One of the potential resources is hydropower, and this is a series of pictures. This one is not real. This is just a fake how it could look like in the future. This dam is not yet built, but it's actually in planning. And you see, this is in principle for a hydropower engineer, it's an ideal situation, because you have this barrier, this rock barrier, and you have this trough, this depression that was filled in earlier times by glaciers. It's the order, you see something like 80 megawatts can be produced here, on the order of several hundred millions of Swiss francs or dollars of investment. Nevertheless, this process has been much better managed than others, but still it's not yet fully decided whether it will be built. And colleagues from DTH have also done a global analysis where the potential could be, and they have detected the important potential for hydropower, but nevertheless in practice, from potential to implementation, it's a lot of questions: legal, environmental, social, etc. Now, the risk, this is in the previous session, we have seen this one. This is risks that also Georg has mentioned from glacial lake outburst floods. And this is the Himalaya Karakoram Hindu Kush. Now, I think what's important, all these bars mean different scenarios, from low emission scenarios to high emission scenarios. And the darkest bar is actually ice-free. So you can also have this, what does it mean between a medium scenario, high emission scenario, and ice-free conditions. And you also see it really depends on the region and locality, whether there's a strong increase in GLOF risk or due to several scenarios, or whether it's rather moderate, like in the eastern part. Karakoram, for instance, has a very steep rise in GLOF risk due to in relation to several scenarios. Now, one of the cases that's going to really be a big issue in the future, more and more, there is also a lot of money now flowing into climate litigation. And this lake, still in Peru, Lake Palcacocha, is the object of a current climate litigation case in Germany, where a citizen of this Varas has sued the German company RWE. Now, the question is, this is now at court, and we are at the evidentiary stage, so we need to, the party needs to demonstrate whether there is a causation between the emissions that have been emitted by RWE and the flood risk that is encountered locally. Now, this is this is in principle attribution science, but it's not just climate science attribution. It's really going into the fields and new fields of impact attribution. And you see this cascade here or chain, and that's a real challenge we have currently in science. How we do an attribution across all these systems. In a recent study, we have shown that basically it can be done, and the colleagues from Oxford have also done a study of that. But it's still, we need to work much more together with the on the one hand with the court, but especially with the legal specialists, because it's not. It really depends what the court is asking for, what kind of causality or causation. So this is a field. I can tell you in the next few years, we will see a lot more climate litigation cases. And the loss of glacial loss, what does it mean for ecosystems? That's from Ecuador, the Antisana, which will lose a lot of glacier masses, and you see different things like lakes, plant colonization front, the wetlands, and peat bogs. On the other hand, here, this is the Altiplano region. These are vulnerable ecosystems. For instance, I know that's not my field, but there's frogs living at 5,000 meters in very extreme conditions. But also these ecosystems, they depend on meltwater from the glaciers. And if the glaciers have gone, they are disconnected and basically degrading, transforming from a carbon sink to a carbon source. And this is something, of course, we want to avoid. Water we have already in the previous presentations. I don't want to go much in detail, but just I like this graph on the left, which is coming from the Swiss Alps. And it basically shows you how the catchment hydrograph will change from like these pink lines, which are the glacier hydrograph, to the green graphs, which are basically a situation without any glacier. So you see a dramatically different hydrograph or water hydrology situation, which is not so much water in peak water in July, but it's more balanced over the year, which has probably advantages and disadvantages, but it implies a fundamental change in management of the water resources. Now, the economics of glacial loss, that's pretty much a new field, a research field. There's very little done. We have done the first study also in Peru, looking basically at concentrating on water resources. And as glaciers will further reduce in a scenario of low emission scenarios and high emission scenarios by mid-century, what does that mean for different sectors, such as agriculture, hydropower, or also the domestic sector? What we found that the biggest part, monetary loss, comes into the agriculture sectors. And the numbers, I was really surprised. I mean, there's questions about the methodology. We need to have more discussions. I was really surprised when we have seen the numbers and the results. This is one catchment, and we're talking here about losses in the order of several hundred millions of dollars per year. So it's really big losses that are coming. And then the intangible losses. These are these kind of losses that I was referring to in the first slide. These are people we were going up in close to Cusco, local people, and basically giving their offerings to the glacier as every time they go up, and they very much experience, of course, and suffer with the loss of glacier. And this can have, interestingly, they do not so much relate the glacier loss to climate change or emissions, but rather to their practices. They think that, for instance, glaciers, mountains are angry because they have problems with littering or because they have abandoned their traditions. It's very interesting how they relate to glacier loss. And now loss and damage. Today at COP, there is the Adaptation and Loss and Damage Day. We have done recently as a review of loss and damage found in the literature in the mountain cryosphere. This is not just glaciers, but mostly glaciers. And you see the category, we distinguish between sudden onset events, such as, for instance, floods, glacier floods, and slow onset, that would be, for instance, water hydrology related to glacier loss. You see, loss and damage to natural resources is a big issue, also to productivity that relates to agriculture, then also people to people and assets. We also have cultural loss and damage and loss of lives. And of course, I mean, I was just in an event in loss and damage, a lot of frustration about the inaction of policy. And I said before, I think we really need to upscale the dialogue and the exchange between science and policy. I mean, saying as a scientist, to further and find solution for this problem, which can no longer be ignored. So thank you very much, and I wish you a very good evening.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Marcela Fernandez, who's telling us about her project in Colombia.
Thank you very much. Greetings from Colombia. And I'm gonna tell you more the story of how I got involved into glaciers without being a scientist, a mountaineering expert. I started a movement called Cumbres Blancas. It's white peaks or white summits in English. And I'm very happy to be here. Last year, I had the privilege to be in the Cryosphere Pavilion. And you guys are lucky, those that are actually there. So Cumbres Blancas was born out of ignorance, out of not knowing that in Colombia we have glaciers. And I realized that if I didn't know that Colombia had glaciers, probably most citizens in my country also didn't know this. So we still have 6 glaciers. And the idea of Cumbres Blancas was born to give them tribute, to of course, visibility to them through creative ways, but also through scientific ways of showing how our terminally ill glaciers are disappearing slowly. You guys can pass the presentation. It's just pictures of the glaciers, so I won't really focus. It's just more focusing on telling you the stories of how we got involved into loving the glaciers. So yes, we started this movement with people that we didn't know each other, photographers, documentalists, scientists, artists, and we started in Colombia. And Heidi Sevestre, which is with you in the Cryosphere Pavilion, was very important for our kickoff because we wanted to give visibility internationally to the reality of our melting glaciers. Today we have 37 square kilometers of ice, and it's precious ice that we don't want to see how they disappeared without us doing anything. So we brought Heidi 6 months after we were born as an organization, and we were able to put 2 time-lapse cameras in 2 of our 6 glaciers, and end-lapse cameras that they donated for us. And these cameras are right now in 2 of our glaciers, showing us how fast they are retrieving. With Heidi, we were also able to bring this message to the Congress of Colombia. Most of them didn't know, politicians didn't know that they were melting so fast. And this created an accidental commission that would help us take decisions to protect not only the glaciers, but lower ecosystems that are called páramos, and bosques altoandinos, and the forest, the Andean forest. So we don't see glaciers as the only fragile ecosystem. We see all the high mountains needing us to speak for them, right? So this started in Colombia. As I said, Heidi was an inspiration, and we keep doing citizens science. We were able to put stakes in glaciers that didn't have stakes. As you know, these stakes are in the profound ice, and we were able to measure. Here you can see the picture. We were able to measure 2 more glaciers that before we had no information about how fast they are retrieving, how fast they are disappearing. And this was able through a program that we called Adopt a Stake. So citizens could put $10, $50, and we were going to put their names high in the glacier when we were able to monitoring them. So this is the message that Cumbres Blancas want to spread, then we realized that Colombia was not the only country needing this kind of collective movement that would mix scientists with indigenous communities, with engineers, with artists. And we were born also in Mexico and in Ecuador very strongly. We actually measured the Antisana Glacier as well, putting a time-lapse camera also donated by NLAPS. And today we are always in conversations with all the countries that have tropical glaciers and see how can we join forces and how can we make a movement that gives visibility to glaciers. What will happen with a Colombia, with a Mexico, with an Ecuador without glaciers? A life without glaciers is not only affecting the landscape, the possibility to see these glaciers from cities and from, let's say, from a touristic perspective, but in our countries, we have more than 40, 50 indigenous communities. And for them, water represents the origin of life, meaning for them, glaciers are gods. And if we lose ice, we lose our gods. We lose the possibility to connect and talk with them through our indigenous communities that live in the different ecosystems where glaciers live. So this is also the cosmovision that we are losing, and we would probably lose lower ecosystems. Colombia has 60% of the páramos in the world, a very unique ecosystem that only exists in 6 countries in the world, and we have 90 different species of a plant that is called frailejón that only lives in this ecosystem. So if glaciers die, we would, or get extinct, as we are predicting it will happen in the next 30 years, we would probably lose a lot of species in the lower ecosystems. So this is why Cumbres Blancas was born. And in Colombia, we launched a book recently in the past 6 months. And this book was the conversation with more than 55 experts in our country, Colombia. And now we are creating this book in the different countries, Mexico and Ecuador for now. It's a photographic experience. We want the book to be an encounter, not as a thesis, not as an academic paper, but as a chronicle, as a romantic way for you to encounter the glaciers and for us to allow this book to go to the different corners of Colombia, to the houses of people that maybe have no idea that glaciers exist, that will never visit a glacier, and getting a more human encounter with this amazing Cumbres Blancas. So thank you so much. We look forward to connect with all those experts and scientists that would love to come to Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, and give us a hand making science cool. Thank you so much.
Questions for any of our presenters today?
I have one, and thank you to all our amazing speakers, whether you are in the room or joining us remotely. This is a question specifically for the virtual speakers. You're not here at COP26. There's a lot happening, a lot you're hearing about through the media. My question to the three of you is, if you were here, what would you like to tell to the climate negotiators? If there's one message you would like to share to COP26, please go ahead.
I can answer briefly for me. I think the one. Sorry, I think the one thing that I would want the people at COP to take away from this is the importance of the mountain glaciers in our world. These are vital for our life and our sustainability on Earth. They have a huge potential to raise global sea levels, but they also have huge potential to drive water shortages, ecological change, and increase risks and hazards. And we must do everything we can to protect them because they're vulnerable and they are retreating quickly.
Yeah, my message is also quite simple. There's no time to waste. The sooner we act, the better.
I would tell them that first they should pass by the Cryosphere Pavilion. No, but I will tell them that that glaciers give us the opportunity to compare years of melting ice, like Regina showed us, like we saw in the presentations. And there's no way to deny that what we are doing is affecting glaciers. So they're just a way for those skepticals to really see that we tiny humans are able to impact ice ages of years that existed before us. Then clearly we can also be the solution, and that glaciers are speaking. It's just a matter of tuning our ears and focusing on what are they saying through science, through movies, through documentaries, through art. Just listen to those fragile ecosystems.
Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, thank you very much to all our speakers. That's the end of our program for today. So hope everyone has a good evening.